certainly didn't expect a pandemic to hit, but when it did, the very first thing that came to mind and into the minds of my sisters was the polio epidemic of 1951, which was so formative in our lives. I had in mind my father, who in 1951 was completely paralyzed by the polio epidemic, hospitalized in an iron lung for 2 years, and he sustained himself knowing that his brain was unaffected. Probably he would never walk again, but he determined to live. I was 4 years old when my father was stricken. The polio vaccine had not been created yet. That did not come till over 2 years later. So the country was in a state of panic, and certain friends, neighbors wouldn't give my sister and myself a ride home, for example, afraid of contagion. It was just a terrible, terrible fear. I remember exactly the night when my father fell. The doctor was called, it's my uncle, and I remember perfectly peeking through the keyhole of the bedroom when my uncle took the hammer to test his reflexes, and there weren't any. And he said, it's polio. And I remember the ambulance, very kind of turquoise blue, and I remember that ambulance pulling away. And again, the story is, and just to relate the pandemic to the epidemic, 3 or 4 hospitals would not admit my father because he was so contagious, and they were not prepared for this. Ultimately, he went to the University of Minnesota. Crucially, for him and for my life, he had an IQ test right away. His brain was a genius, IQ was fine, and he determined to live. Although the great neurologist, Abe Baker, said, I have never seen anyone so compromised with polio before. He will not live more than 2-3 years, and he lived for 16 years by virtue of will and courage. Now, it's very much worth mentioning that he had fought in World War II when he was called upon then to rise to the occasion. The tank in front of his was blown to bits. He was leading an Iron Tank Division. He became captain on the spot and received a Silver Star. It's the kind of courage and service. He was a man committed to serve his fellow man. Confined to an iron lung, he returned home after 2 years in hospital. Breathing for him was not involuntary. During sleep, he was aided by a rocking bed. He conducted his law practice from a wheelchair, upright and alert in mind, reminding himself to breathe. He chose the law, and that was, of course, great good fortune, because coming out of hospital 2 years later, completely paralyzed from the neck down, he went to his office every day in a wheelchair with a male aide. We had an aide, and he worked in that wheelchair. And to see him, you know, with his files in front of him, he held himself proud. All he could move was an index finger, which was fitted with a pen, with a little, so he could sign his documents.